all huddled around a cradle in Bethlehem, marveling at this child that was born under a star, wrapped in swaddling cloths. And yet here we are this morning, as our lectionary text from Luke seems to have us, watching as a fellow named John is baptizing an endless line of faithful pilgrims who are coming to him at the Jordan River. Among them, the very much adult man, Jesus. What's the church's big rush anyway? Why don't we spend more time talking about Jesus growing up? About Jesus interacting with his peers, hanging around the neighborhood, helping out around the house? Well, the reason we don't is pretty obvious from the standpoint of Scripture. We really don't have much of anything substantial to work with. Other than a few brief accounts in the Gospel of Luke telling us about the dedication of Jesus in the temple some days after he was born, and then that episode that you heard about at worship last Sunday when Jesus at the age of 12 was taken to Jerusalem along with his family and he kind of gets separated from them. Other than those two accounts, both of which, by the way, are intentional stories inserted by Luke to help frame out who Luke believes Jesus is, most of Jesus' life is a mystery. We know essentially nothing of those first 30 years in what was in totality maybe 31 to 33 years. Oh, we know Jesus was raised by Mary and Joseph. We know he had brothers and sisters. We know he lived in the northern town of Nazareth, and that perhaps at least for a part of his life, he was by trade a carpenter. But other than that, the rest is sheer speculation. We can only guess at his level of education, for instance, whether he could speak the Greek language or whether he knew how to dance. We can only guess about the tone of his voice, whether he had a high-pitched voice like mine or whether he spoke like Kent Carsten's. We can only guess about the size and structure of his physique, his daily routine, his circle of friends, and yes, the degree and manner by which he even expressed his sexuality. Though to mention that last item tends to get us all worked up, because there's a part of us that prefers to think that Jesus was above all of that. There just seems to be so much room for conjecture, doesn't there? But this we do know. Of this, all four of our Gospels are in complete agreement. That when he was around 30 years old, Jesus made a serious change in his life direction. Whatever he had been for those previous 30 years, that part of his life came to an end. While he likely valued a great deal his role of being a son and a brother and a carpenter and a friend to his friends and maybe even a liturgist at the synagogue where he worshiped, Jesus became something new, something singularly focused and determined. And that personal dynamic of serious life adjustment, that turning that took place within him, took concrete form when he stepped into the waters of the Jordan River. Everything that Jesus will be from that point on, for what will remain of his life, it will carry with it the power of his conviction. It will carry with it the power of his personal spirituality. It will carry with it the power of that conclusion that he reached about what was of ultimate concern, ultimate significance within this life. I think most of us inwardly crave to find that same kind of conviction and personal spirituality in our lives. I think most of us want to be passionate about that which is deserving of our passion. I also think that's why so many folks are disillusioned when they come to the institutional church. They come to the church looking for meaning and purpose. They come to us trying to discover and connect with that which is of ultimate concern in this life. And so often they are frustrated. Frustrated because they perceive us to be preoccupied by what seems to them to be trivial. Former Vice President Al Gore, in his 2006 ecological video entitled An Inconvenient Truth, which, apart from any politics, I encourage you strongly to view. By the way, we're going to have a 4-week class following Easter, and this video will be a part of that class as we talk about ecology and our responsibility to the world. But in that video, Al Gore at one point describes some of the significant steps that brought him to that point of becoming one of the most vocal proponents for protecting our environment. He tells about how when he was in college, he had a certain professor who captured his attention and awakened him to the dangerous trends that, especially over these last 50 years, have placed our planet in peril. He tells about becoming involved in the early environmental movement of the 1960s as young people were coming alive to politics and social action, trying to make a difference, trying to really impact the world and not just take up space. Gore describes his early efforts to work through governmental channels to bring about change through legislation, only to find that there was always something else that seemed to be more pressing within our Congress, always something else that seemed to bump environmental concerns from the front burner to the back burner. It obviously became tempting to Gore at that point to simply turn his attention away from the environment altogether and to give his energies over to efforts which were more publicly popular and politically advantageous. And Al Gore may have actually done so, but then his 6-year-old son was struck down by a car in a 1989 accident, and he almost died. April 3rd, 1989, Gore recounts, "My son pulled loose of my hand and chased his friend across the street." Sitting next to his son in the intensive care unit for the next month, reflecting on all of those things that prior to the accident had seemed so important and had captured so much of his time and energy and imagination, Gore goes on to say, "It was almost as if you could look at my planning calendar and everything just flew off. It was all so trivial, insignificant." He goes on to say, "This turned my whole world upside down and then shook it until everything fell out. My way of being in the world, it just changed for me." And he finally says, "How should I spend my time on this earth?" He raised the question, the ultimate question. Well, the impact of all of this on Al Gore's life found its measure in the focus of his life in the months and years to follow, even up to this current day. He writes, "I really dug in trying to learn about the dangers to our environment much more deeply. I went to Antarctica the North Pole, the Amazon. I went to places where scientists could help me understand parts of the issue I didn't really understand in depth. And he says, I felt that we could really lose it, that we could lose our planet, that what we take for granted might not be here for our children. How many of us have such inner conviction to work for, to live for such ultimate things? For most of us, it sounds simply too difficult, too uncertain. It seems too unreachable. We feel like Don Quixote when we talk about such things, especially when it's just so easy to live for our next paycheck, or our next meal, or our next day of golf, or our next vacation, or our next family get-together. But living for ultimate things, how do we live so that our community, our world may know peace? How do we live so that everyone may have enough to eat and have access to clean drinking water and adequate health care? How do we live so that in our daily interactions, people through us are able to actually have a glimpse of the character of our God? How do we live so that every person may be able to discover the potential for joy and love that God has built right into us, right into our human framework? To work for and to live for such ultimate concerns may indeed be difficult, uncertain, seemingly unreachable. But I want to suggest to you that it was precisely to such ultimate concern that Jesus gave himself as he entered the waters of the Jordan River and offered himself to God. And my friends, I want to suggest to you this morning that Jesus is inviting all of us here at St. Paul, as we begin this new year together, to enter into those same waters with him. To measure what we will dream, to measure how we will plan, to measure how we will worship, to measure how we will work, to measure what we will do individually and collectively each day as a church, to measure it by God's mighty purpose for the world. I want to close this morning with some words that George Bernard Shaw wrote so long ago, and they're wonderful words. I want you to hear them with me. He wrote, "This is the true joy of life, being used for a purpose recognized by yourself as a mighty one. Being a force of nature instead of a feverish, selfish little clod of ailments and grievances, complaining that the world will not devote itself to making you happy. Shaw concludes with these words. He says, "I want to be thoroughly used up when I die, for the harder I work, the more I live. I rejoice in life for its own sake. Life is no brief candle for me. It is a sort of splendid torch that I have hold of for the moment. And I want to make it burn as brightly as possible before handing it on to the future generations." My friends, let each of us grab this torch, lift it high, and embrace this life which our God calls us to live, to God's glory. Amen. At this time, I would like to invite all those who will be on our 2007 church board